Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Phil, after years ago when I last saw you in Sarras, to talk to you again and to introduce you, Professor Philip Gulliver, who has done more field work in East Africa than almost any other living anthropologist, and is the author of a number of books, including The Family Herds and Social Control in an African Society, and a number of others. Phil, how did you first come to be an anthropologist?
Well, my appetite was whetted for things esoteric because I was stationed in the Middle East during World War II. I began to learn Arabic. I began to look at Leverhulme villages because I happened to be near the airfield where I was stationed, and later on Bedouin when I was up the Western Desert. And this was utterly novel to me. I'd led rather a cloistered life in the heart of the English shires before. It was something completely new. I never thought about it before, but it seemed to me fascinating. I went back to university after the war, did a sociology degree, and during that time became acquainted with Malinowski. And when the Colonial Social Science Research Council was set up and they offered fellowships to do research in various places in the colonial empire, I leapt at it as an opportunity, first of all, to look at peoples of the kind that I'd briefly seen during the war, as an opportunity to travel, and as an opportunity to get away from the awfulness of post-war Britain. So I did that, and I chose, for reasons that are now obscure to me, to go to East Africa, because there were choices to go to West Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and so on. I chose East Africa for a reason that I can no longer tell you. I don't remember it, that's what I mean. And so that was how I came to get into anthropology. They also gave me a year's graduate fellowship at the LSE to read more anthropology and to sit at the feet of people like Raymond Fith and Edmund Leach, and who else was there? Nadel, Audrey Richards. There was a whole bevy of stars at that time, just after the war at the LSE. And I never regretted my choice. But that was how I got into it, at any rate. I chose as my first field research project to go to somewhere that was really unknown ethnographically, and rather look down on those people that went to study towns or people who were growing cotton or something. So I chose to go to northern Kenya to work amongst pastoral nomads, which was as far out as I could get, I think. I was imbued, I think, with a Boy Scout spirit sort of thing. And it was pretty tough, but it was great. I don't advise anybody who is not still very young to do that sort of thing, but I never regretted doing it. It was exciting in every sense of the word. It was exciting anthropologically, it was exciting personally. And I was fortunate enough that money was reasonably plentiful. This was 48, I went out, to be able to get money to stay there for 2 years, and indeed to extend my studies over the border into Uganda for another 8 months. I did over 2.5 years field work.
Who were the people you studied?
This was the Turkana.
What about the Turkana did you find, from your background in the Shires, most striking and interesting?
Well, the first thing that struck me when I arrived was the desolation of the desert, and I couldn't imagine how anybody lived there. And I had to drive in from the then Kenya White Highlands, something like 200 miles to the district headquarters, and during that drive I scarcely saw a single Turkana. I couldn't imagine where they lived, let alone how they lived. Because as I found out later, the road went through some of the worst desert parts. It wasn't all quite as bad as that. So that was my first impression, was, my God, how am I going to find people? But secondly, how am I going to discover how they live in such a tough environment? When I arrived at the district headquarters, it so happened that the government was holding a big meeting of chiefs, government-appointed chiefs, not indigenous, and there they all were with various retainers and so on, all excitedly talking away in their language, and I thought, my God, how am I ever going to understand what they're saying, not only what they're saying, but what it means to them, and so on. And it was an exciting, but nevertheless, in a little way, a rather apprehensive introduction to doing anthropology. After that, it really was, it turned into an ecological study primarily because one couldn't study pastoral nomads in semi-desert conditions without studying the ecological factors. Almost everything else that one wanted to study, whether it was kinship or politics or religion or family and marriage and so on, this ecological factor was always there. So I suppose, although I'd not intended it this way, really I'd gone in, I think, to do political anthropology insofar as I was at all clear, but in those days we went in to do everything. We didn't go in with hypotheses to prove or disprove. We didn't go in, on the whole, to do a particular kind of thing. We had certain interests, such as mine was in political anthropology, but we went in to do everything. And I remember being told by Raymond Fith that it was our moral duty to do everything, from recording meteorological statistics to taking soil samples if we could get someone to analyse them, etc., etc. So I did more or less try to do what Raymond had told me I should do, to do everything. Obviously I didn't, though I sometimes kidded myself that I did. And I did concentrate on political anthropology, but then kinship, as so often, overtook that, and my main focus was in kinship studies there. But again, within the ecological framework, because that's unavoidable.
You mentioned Raymond Fith several times. Was he the person who influenced you most theoretically?
At that time, no, I think, although he was tremendously influential, he was head of the department at the LSE at the time. He wasn't my supervisor. But the man I think I respected most, although I told you there were these other stars at the LSE then, and they all had their influence. One sat in lectures from Leach, who was thinking about Han Burma at the time, and Nadel, or whatever he was thinking about, etc.
What was Nadel like?
Extremely brilliant lecturer. But I sometimes wondered whether he was not a bit disconnected from real life. He was highly theoretical and rather philosophical, I felt. Consequently, he didn't influence me personally as much, although I'm sure I learned a lot from him. Whereas Fith's kind of anthropology was the sort that appealed to me then. But you asked me who my main influence was at that time. I think probably Malinowski. But I remember that Meyer Fortey's 2 books on the Tallensi had just been published, and indeed I remember in Raymond Firth's seminar, which still then was called the Malinowski Seminar, Friday mornings, I remember we dissected Meyer Fortey's 2 Tallensi books, and they certainly influenced me a very great deal. I think I absorbed structural functionalism not by being taught it specifically, and indeed I can't remember reading very much Ratcliffe Brown at the time. Of course one had to go to his scattered papers if he wanted to read him. But I at any rate absorbed it, I think, through Meyer Fortey's writings, through EP's writings, and such at that time as Gluckman had already started. Later on, Gluckman was a considerable influence with me. I was never a colleague of his, although we became quite close friends later on. But I think he influenced me perhaps as much as any single anthropologist has done.
Not Evans Pritchard, because I would have thought with his East African pastoral.
No, not really. I'm not trying to denigrate him. I'm not trying to say he wasn't influential. I'm not saying I didn't admire him, but I don't think he influenced me as much as Gluckman did. One of the main reasons there was that later on, not in my study of Turkana, but later on when I was in Tanganyika, I began to move in, not deliberately, rather I kind of slid in sideways into legal anthropology. And then, of course, Gluckman was the leading figure, and he was just beginning to publish his stuff. And I remember my delight in reading the judicial process amongst the Barozzi whilst I was actually in the field, being very critical of it, and thinking, well, it's not a bit like where I am, but nevertheless, he made me think, and he made me argue, and until Max died, I spent a lot of time arguing with him, often by correspondence rather than face-to-face. So it was partly as a result of the kind of anthropology that later I moved into. I had no intention ever of doing that. It came out of various field situations that I was in. But Max influenced me in the so-called Manchester School too, people like Turkana, with whom I was friendly, and others there at Manchester. Certainly I think in the middle of my career, that was the most influential thing. Sometimes people used to refer to me as a Manchester man, and I never was a Manchester man, oddly enough, and did no more than visit Manchester like other people did.
What sort of man was Gluckman when he was...
Heavens, how can I sum up Max? A very generous person, rather egocentric, but then perhaps most anthropologists are. I mean, he liked to talk about himself and his own work. But even so, he was very interested in listening to what other people were doing, because he was always ready to incorporate other people's ideas into his own. I found him extremely helpful as a human being, as a fellow anthropologist, senior to me, of course, an elder brother or something of that kind. I liked him, I respected his work, although I could indeed have given criticism of his stuff, but I respected him to the point where after he died I got together a number of legal anthropologists in North America to do a symposium on him and to pay homage and respect, and at the same time to act as a critique of his work.
It's nice you use the metaphor of an elder brother, because I've heard the genealogy described as by Meyer Fortes, as Meyer looked on UP as his elder brother and Max as his younger brother, so you were the fourth brother in that.
Oh dear. Well, you see, I regard Meyer and EP as definitely of the parental generation. Max was somewhere in between. But I never got to know EP all that well. Meyer I did get to know later. And it wasn't that Meyer was at all authoritarian or anything like that, but nevertheless he definitely belongs to the generation before. Max was much more sociable kind, and he was more like, I think, an elder brother. I don't know why I say that. It's not a bit like my own elder brother, so it's not that image. But he somehow was that little bit nearer than EP and Meyer,
yes,
and one or two of the other older people.
You mentioned your difference with Max Gluckman on analysis of legal matters. Could you say something about what that difference was?
Well, Max's two studies, one among the Zulu, the other amongst the Barozzi, were in hierarchical societies with authoritarian structures, and in his study of law he was studying courts with judges, and judges who were at the same time chiefs and princes, either political figures, political authoritarian figures. And Max, in my opinion, like that of some others at any rate, was trying, partly consciously, partly perhaps unconsciously, to use the model of Anglo-American jurisprudence to analyse the Barozzi material. Now, it so happened that most of my experience in East Africa was in societies that were not hierarchical, that didn't have chiefs, didn't have centralised political systems. And my interest was in the study of dispute management, conflict resolution, call it what you will, in situations where there were not authority figures. I could never get Max to see, at least I felt I couldn't, that there were other kinds of dispute management processes. He tended, I think, to see everything in terms of courts and judges and authority figures. We argued many times on this, and he was always trying to persuade me that in fact I'd seen it wrong, that what I was calling negotiations really were court-like procedures. So we did have, coming out of our data, different interests and which produced different kinds of analyses and different kind of theoretical interests. Speaking about myself, I moved in the direction of the social psychologists and some of the sociologists who are concerned with dispute management in non-court situations, and that has been my specialisation. So it wasn't altogether that I suppose I disagreed with Max, although I was moving away from structural functionalism, whereas he would remain, I think, to his death, a thoroughgoing structural functionalist, despite his introduction of conflict and so on. It was still in a structural functional mode. I was wanting to move out of that. I was finding myself much more influenced by transactionalism and exchange theory and so on, which seemed to fit the data that I'd got and the kind of analysis I wanted to make. So I was moving away from him at that time, but we still argued, and I still found him one of the most fruitful people against whom to sharpen my wits and to rethink what I was doing. Because he was, even if he perhaps didn't entirely understand my data, and that sounds awful to say that, but I will say it anyway, he was always sympathetic, and he would write me, as he did many other people I gather, long letters of re-criticism of something that I'd done, which were genuine and thoughtful, and of course he always expected a reply, and if one didn't reply then he got a bit fussed. So one had to reply, and he replied back, and a lot of my relationship with him was in these long letters, because we only met every now and again. But it was, to me, very fruitful. It's a man I admire considerably, despite his defects, like anybody else.
What do you think, looking back over your theoretical work, was the most exciting discovery or insight you had? What excited you most at the time?
That's a difficult one to answer. I would say when it occurred to me that these processes of dispute management in situations of a completely non-court, non-authoritarian kind, that these processes, which I've studied amongst the Arusha, amongst the Indenduri and elsewhere, but I've written 2 monographs on that, when I discovered that they were essentially similar, as I see it, to the kind of negotiation processes that go on in, first of all, Western societies. I got at this through studying labour disputes between trade unions and employers, that the same kind of process was going on. And I was able eventually to produce a model which encompassed both Western societies and my own stuff in East Africa, plus what I could glean from books from other parts of the world too, that I could find a model for a particular kind of interaction which was applicable right across the board. That despite the enormous differences between an industrial dispute in, say, General Motors in Detroit and a couple of Arusha villages arguing over a land boundary, that in fact they were going through essentially the same process. And this to me was tremendously exciting because it enabled me in a way to get out of this anthropological bind of just studying quote-unquote primitive societies or third world societies or whatever. And really, perhaps for the first time, to be studying human beings everywhere. And this was exciting. Perhaps by that time I was getting over my excitement of studying the esoteric, which I'd done now for a good many years. And I wanted to broaden out, and this gave me the opportunity to do so.
Which leads on perhaps to your current work. I gather you're working in Ireland, but...
Yes, I am. In a way, I've gone back to square one in this work. I've gradually lost interest in Africa, partly as a result of what I've just been telling you, that I was beginning to develop models and see processes which were common to people everywhere. And so I wanted to change direction and do more field research in a completely different area. And the reason I chose Ireland, well, to be perfectly frank and honest, the reason I chose Ireland was that they speak English and I didn't have to learn another language, which I couldn't think I could cope with at my age. I didn't make out I'm that ancient, but I didn't want the problems of learning another language in the field, etc., etc. But I'd long been interested in Ireland anyway. It would be too long a story to go into why. And I also wanted to study in a Western country. I didn't want to come back to England. I'd already left England, and anyway, for long I've had a love-hate relationship with England. I didn't want to do research here. I could have done. I could have done the kind of thing that I'm now doing in many parts of the Western world, but Ireland fitted well, and it's been gloriously successful. Well, it is being gloriously successful because I'm still engaged in fieldwork. I've just taken time off to come to this conference. When I say I started again at square one, I mean that in a quite serious way, in that the kind of research, field research I'm now doing is very different from what I've done before. Not only the ease with which one can do it because there aren't language problems, and I'd never realised before just how severe language problems can be. I'm not good at languages, but I think even those anthropologists that are perhaps don't altogether realise how much time they spend on purely linguistic learning in order to do the job. That was one thing, but the main thing that has struck me is the richness of the archival material. And so I'm doing a historical study from 1840 to 1983, and a great deal of that is coming from archival sources which are almost inexhaustibly rich. Already, together with a colleague, we've amassed well over 10,000 pages of field data of one sort and another.
The sort of records that you could use included parochial records of births, marriages and deaths, and that these were mainly accurate. What other kinds of records and documents are you using?
Well, first of all, the newspapers. There were, right through the period with which I'm concerned, there were always 2 newspapers published twice a week until quite recently. Now they publish once a week, sometimes 3. And these newspapers have been combed through largely by field assistants rather than by myself, because it takes at least 2 days to go through a year's issue of one of these newspapers, and they're huge bound volumes. Extracting everything that relates to the particular area we're studying, which is in the southern part of Kilkenny County in the Republic of Ireland, and other stuff relating to the county in general, more general stuff. And again, starting in about 1900, we're able to go through the newspaper stories with selected informants and get them to flesh them out and tell us what was the real story behind the news report, give us more information and so on. Whether it's cases of court cases, for instance, then I can get much more on that. That's an old interest of mine, of course. But virtually everything. What happened and so died in an accident and so on. What happened afterwards? This kind of thing. Similarly, we got hold of trade union records. There was a trade union branch formed in 1911, and we've got the minute books. We've been able to go through these minute books with some older people, a couple of them still remaining, they're both in their 70s, who were strongly left-wing, believe it or not, in Catholic Ireland. And again, to get them to flesh out the details in the minutes. Now, what was going on here, where there was some argument in a meeting of the union. More recently, there's been a community council formed the last 15 years. The traders in the town have got what they call a development association. We've got the minute books for both of these, and again we've gone through the minute books with selected informants, getting them to give us the stuff that's not in the minute books, but using these as a basis for which to carry out our open-ended interviews. We have farm records in some cases, not as fully as we'd like. Most farmers have not kept their records, but some have. Unfortunately, no estate records. There weren't many big estates in the area, and the two main ones, there are no records existing. So unlike most people who do research in rural Ireland, this is something we don't have. The censuses for 1901 and 1911 are completely open, so we've got copies of the returns for the censuses. And again, we got these right at the beginning. In fact, one of the first things I did in power with the parochial records I was telling you about was to go through these censuses one by one with selected informants, asking about the people, what happened to them afterwards, as much data as we could get on them, and all sorts of things came out of that, including additions to the genealogies that we'd been building up and checks on the genealogies and so on. We have not completely full, but fairly full records of the big flour mill that was in the town until the 1950s, not only the labour books, and that is useful in itself, who was working, when the wages they were paid, etc. But the lists of the farmers who brought corn in to be ground, where they came from, the sales of flour and of corn and of wholemeal and so on. There was also a tannery in the town, and we've got the books on that as well, and we've gone through those with selected informants. And now those are both closed. They're both closed in the 50s, but they've been replaced, as it were, by one fairly large modern factory employing about 130, 140 people, plus two smaller factories. We've had access to their labour books. In fact, and also there's a large confectioner in the town employing about 50 people, and the head of that business has opened his books to us after a certain amount of negotiation that he has. We're not supposed to reveal the personal details of the wages of people, because these come right up to date, you see. I mean, right up to at least 1982, I've looked at this year's. Finding out who were employed, where they came from, because not all of them were locally residents, and we wanted to know where workers did come from, how long they remained. And for some of these smaller enterprises, we have details of their purchases and their sales and so on. So that has been another archival source, which again we've used to get information through open-ended interviews with people, whether it be the factory manager himself or employees there and so on. In addition to all this archival stuff, of course, we've continued to do participant observation in the more or less orthodox anthropological fashion, and to tie the whole thing together.
Has the fact that you're now working in a society where you do have these very good records altered your view of the nature or accuracy of participant observation? Has it surprised you in any way, or?
I don't think it has. What it has done for me is compelled me, and I wasn't really need to be compelled very strongly. It has encouraged me, perhaps would be a better way of putting it, to take a much more historical perspective. In East Africa, where there were virtually no archival sources, almost none, for the Turkana, where I first went in Kenya, there were virtually none. A few DC's reports of treks they'd made and so on, most of which were highly inaccurate. And so it's been difficult to take a historical perspective, and I think I was over-influenced by the structural functional thing anyway, that people don't have history, or you know what RB and all the rest of them said. And I didn't push the historical side as much as I should have done. I think historians have shown us now that in East Africa and elsewhere there's much more history than we were aware of. But be that as it may, in this case, one couldn't and one wouldn't want to ignore history. And very definitely the project has got a fundamental historical genuine historical orientation. The fact that we started in 1840, which is just before the Great Famine, that was deliberately chosen, although the first census was in 1841, and that also was a factor in choosing 1840 as a date, so that we can look at immediate pre-famine conditions, then the famine, and then the whole business of the 19th century, but right through. It's not just history that I'm concerned with, whatever just history is, and certainly I want to use my anthropological and analytical skills to analyse history, and probably in something like a dependency mode of analysis. But as I tell the people when they ask me what I'm doing, I said we wanted to do history, but they wanted to know more than that. And I said, well, I want to know how it is that things have come to be the way they are today. So this allows me both to concentrate on today and on the history. Because at first, when I said I was doing history, they couldn't understand, well, why do you want to know all about today, who is marrying who, etc., etc. So I enlarged in that way, and they certainly accepted this. Now, of course, I can't easily envisage how one would do an anthropological study without a historical perspective. But of course, like so many of my peers, I did in the past.
Do you see the two? Sorry.
No, come on.
Do you see the two, therefore, as I think Pritchard did, really as very, very similar? Or?
Yes, I do. I do. I'm not sure whether history's got to become anthropology or anthropology's got to become history. But I think very definitely anthropologists have got to take a historical point of view. I think we probably, and I'm speaking to you as a half historian, I think you are, I think we've got to learn a lot from historians, and I don't think we've perhaps applied ourselves sufficiently to that. I've been trying to talk to historians, not as much as I should, but I'm going to be talking to more back home in my own university and around in Canada. I think we've got a lot to learn of the techniques of the historian. And we've got to be humble about this and not pretend that we know everything and we can ignore what the historians have been doing over the centuries. But as I say, I find it now difficult to envisage doing an anthropological study that is not historical. Perhaps that is in the flush of enthusiasm with my Irish research, but I think wherever I went now, I wouldn't be happy to go off and say study the Turkana as I did, if it were not possible to have the full historical perspective. Whether in fact it would be possible to go and study the Turkana with a historical perspective, I'm not quite sure. Still, I'm not quite convinced. But if I may tell you a little anecdote which is maybe interesting and instructive. Many years after I worked in Turkana and adjacent people in Uganda, the GA, and I was teaching at Saraz, a history graduate student came along to me and said he wanted to go and do a historical study of the GA. And I said to him, well, I think you're going to be wasting your time. I really, there are other places in East Africa that would be more profitable for you, because he was doing a PhD thesis, of course. You're really going to spend a year and you're not going to get very much information, and possibly not going to get enough to do a PhD thesis, etc., and your career may be damaged. But anyway, he was strong-minded about this, and he was supported by Roland Oliver, who was then Professor of African History at SARS, and he persisted anyway. So I gave him access to my notes and my experience and everything else, and he went off for the year and came back, of course, with a tremendous amount of history. It was a very salutary lesson to me that I'd worked, this was the GA rather than Turkana, but they're closely related. I'd worked in that area for 8 months and garnered almost no history at all. Partly because I was focusing on what was happening there and then, but partly because I believed that, not that they had no history, but that history was unimportant to them as well as to me. I just hadn't pressed the right buttons, both in my own mind and with the people I was talking about. This man went out there, I'm talking to John Lamphere, who you may know. John went out and disproved me, and since then, of course, I really have been converted to, to the fact that history is possible, even in a society like that. But of course, one doesn't need convincing when you go to a country like Ireland, where the archives are so rich.
Could I ask one last question, because we ought to end then? Contrasting the people of your East African pastoralists and the people you meet in Southern Ireland, a question that often I ponder on is whether this idea of anthropology, of the psychic unity of mankind, that basically deep down we are all humans and the differences between us are very slight, as compared to, say, the differences between humans and animals. Do you feel, when you're dealing with people in Southern Ireland and remembering your African work, do you feel these are poles apart, or?
Oh, I vary on that. Sometimes I feel they're absolutely poles apart. And sometimes I do feel that there is a tremendous similarity. They are so often doing the same kind of things, engaging in the same kind of struggles and conflicts and hopes and fears, the same kind of social relationships. The structure of the, shall we say, the family or something may be on the surface so different, and yet when you see what goes on inside the structure, it is often so very similar. I'm speaking in very broad general terms. I'm not trying to put a thesis over the psychic unity of mankind. I wouldn't want to do that, frankly. I wouldn't quite know how to support it, but nevertheless, studying the Irish, Southern Irish, studying the Turkana and the ones, I don't know whether they're in between, I don't mean them as opposite ends of a continuum. One not only is looking at the same sorts of social relationships and social processes, but one's also looking at the same sorts of people. I find some of the old people that we've been talking to in Ireland, going through this archival material, they are not all that dissimilar when really inside to some of the old people I talk to on the top one. Of course, they look absolutely different. The Irish elderly people, I think, would be shocked indeed if I said that. This was Turkana, and I certainly don't say it to them. I don't think they would quite understand what I'm trying to say. But they are really very similar. I think human beings are. The range of variations, which does seem enormous, in fact, is not as great as it does seem.
Well, on that cheerful note, now thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Thank you.